Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Asia podcast. I'm Doug Krisner. You can join Brian Curtis and myself for the stories making news and moving markets in the APAC region. You can subscribe to the show anywhere you get your podcast and always on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Terminal, and the Bloomberg Business app.
Joining us on the line now, or in our studios rather, is Vlad Savov, Bloomberg Tech Editor, to take a closer look at Nvidia. We want to talk about the China angle, Vlad, but I wanted to mention as well that, the stock did trade up in after hours. And if you look at the analyst coverage, you've got 60 buys, 5 holds, and 1 sell. You wonder about the 1 sell. But anyway, is that likely to continue given all you saw from the earnings today?
Maybe that 1 sell was just somebody who's profit taken. They bought Nvidia in 2008 and now they're just cashing it in. What can I tell you about this company? When you look at its profits, they are just stratospheric relative to the previous year. We're talking $22 billion. It's a record quarterly profit that they just reported. Expectations for Nvidia have been sky high and it keeps outperforming. And this is a full year of quarterly results being better than already elevated expectations. A good way to contextualize this is NVIDIA's history is as a graphics card maker. Graphics cards, GPU, gaming, that was $2.9 billion out of that $22 billion. So the company is churning out huge revenues and sales and outperforming even sky-high expectations.
Yeah, but the power of those chips, that's why they're so great for, crunching AI data. They're lightning fast and robust as well. But the one thing that I think Brian was kind of alluding to when the company says that China data center revenue was down significantly, and you can obviously look to the U.S. export controls as a big reason for that. But in my mind, I'm thinking, if I'm in the artificial intelligence business in China and I don't have access to the most advanced chips from Nvidia, I'm at a big disadvantage, right?
That's absolutely right. What is going to require is a fair amount of creativity, because the way that things are structured today, when you think about ChatGPT kickstarting this entire thing, the whole technology is based on transformers, and those are designed to run on NVIDIA's CUDA architecture. So without getting too geeky into it, there is no other NVIDIA. NVIDIA designed the whole thing. Everybody just jumped aboard and found it to be the most efficient way. So the way to go about it today and in the future is to come up with more power-efficient AI models, to come up with lighter workloads, and then figure out ways to achieve what companies like OpenAI are doing with a whole bunch of NVIDIA GPUs today.
Well, we know you like to geek out a little bit. NVIDIA has been sending some samples of new chips to China that are compliant with the U.S. restrictions. So will that be enough?
Right. Well, it's been a fascinating back and forth between NVIDIA and the U.S. government. The U.S. government imposed sanctions to get NVIDIA's most advanced chips to make them inaccessible to China, and then NVIDIA effectively chopped them down to spec so they could get into China. Then the U.S. government said, you can't do that. They had back and forth, they had conversation. NVIDIA did say after its earnings that it's confident that the things that it's sampling, the chips that it's sampling to China today, are in compliance with those regulations now.
Yeah, Brian was talking about a story where the Commerce Department here in the U.S. was suspending permission for some U.S. suppliers to sell products to the most advanced semiconductor plant in China that's run by SMIC. Can you imagine a world in the next 2 years, let's say, where China has caught up to NVIDIA, or is it so far behind now where a company like NVIDIA, or to a lesser extent, let's say AMD or even Intel, is playing? Is China that far behind?
Well, let's say it will be shocking. I can't say it's never going to happen, because I might have said that about NVIDIA doing 10 times its earnings in the space of a year, right? So things can move really quickly. There can be breakthroughs. We saw that with the Huawei chip out of China last year. Mm-hmm. That being said, the amount of investment and time that goes into building this, NVIDIA started this entire thing more than a decade ago. When you think about TSMC, which is the world's leading chip maker, they're investing $30 billion a year just in CapEx. So for China to do it, it's not just a matter of money and resources, it really is time as well.
It's not only China that's far behind, but even AMD. It's rolled out this accelerator, the MI300, and it expects revenue to be $3.5 billion this year, $3.5 billion, and NVIDIA is doing $80 billion plus. So it shows you the gap. Can AMD narrow that gap?
I believe that's much more of a viable proposition. And if you talk to AMD, they're saying that they're already doing it. The thing is, again, it takes time. It takes time to ramp up. It takes time to have the companies, the customers who adopt your technology. That's $3 billion just from AI for AMD, just to be clear. They do have all the other business with graphics and processors as well. Look, AMD is growing, and I said this to your colleagues in Europe yesterday. There is a world in which AMD can fulfill all of its ambitious targets and grow its AI sales, and for Nvidia to still struggle to provide as many GPUs as the market demands from it.
Yeah, the demand is that strong.
Where does ARM Holdings come in all of this? I mean, obviously the British chip designer that's owned by SoftBank, are they involved at the periphery of kind of advancing the next generation of AI chips?
Right. It depends. I mean, if you ask the company, they're not at the periphery. They are at the heart of it. They're the future of AI, because what NVIDIA is really great at is AI training. So talking to its competitors like Intel, like ARM, they're saying the next stage in AI is inference. It's the AI that happens on devices. And every smartphone today is basically running on ARM technology. Or the Apple chips for even its desktop computers are ARM technology. So when you think 1, 2, 3 years down the line, it may indeed be ARM who's leading the way.
You mentioned that demand was still so strong that even AMD could produce and produce and produce, and it wouldn't really close the gap that much. Jensen Huang did say today that supply and demand was coming more into balance. If that's true, does that mean the prices may come down for those NVIDIA chips?
Well, that's the fascinating thing. I was thinking NVIDIA could effectively name its price over the past year. Everyone was in such a rush and a hurry to get the chips in place because, as I say, it's AI training. It's the very initial stages before you actually produce an AI model that you can start monetizing as a business, right? So everyone wants to have that as early as possible. That's why the competition has been there. I think NVIDIA can probably sustain its pricing just because the demand was so much higher. It could have dictated its price previously. Yep. There's more competition coming down the line, though.
Vlad, thanks very much for joining us. Vlad Savov there, Bloomberg Tech editor. In his spare time for fun, he reads very dense technical manuals, just to be entertained. Vlad, thanks again. And we'll have you back soon. China is said to have banned institutional investors from reducing their equity holdings at the open and close each day. And joining us for some analysis on this is Jill Disis, Bloomberg's China Eco-Gov editor. So they can sell, but they can't sell more than they buy, Jill. So it's a kind of, you can't reduce your position or you can't do net selling. I'm curious what institutional investors are saying about this. I mean, this is kind of astonishing. Are we hearing much from, this is a Bloomberg story, of course, are we hearing much from investors?
Yes. Well, Brian, I think at the point here, it's really, this is about the government trying to alleviate some of the selling pressure. I think the backstory that you have to keep in mind here is that, we've seen some increased pressure in recent days, particularly from the government to sort of clamp down on quantitative trading. What happened was on Monday, there was a major hedge fund in China that sold something like the equivalent of like $350 million worth of shares within a minute of the open on Monday. And so it's really here about, curbing some of this volatility. So I think from an investor perspective, obviously confidence is a much bigger issue in China right now. But I think at least from the government's perspective, this is really about trying to clamp down on volatility within the market. So
the CSRC, we know, has a new chairman now, Wu Qing, and I'm wondering whether he's the architect of this. And basically he was, I'm going to use the term, hired to do something like this as a way of bringing stability to the equity market. I mean, the stakes are pretty high, aren't they?
They are. And look, I mean, we're not sure entirely what his role, particularly in this move, was. But yes, I mean, this does come just a couple of weeks after he was appointed to this position. And Wu Qing also has quite a storied history of clamping down on behavior within the market like this. In his previous job, he was really known as the broker butcher within China. So, I mean, he's kind of here to, sort of slam down the hammer and and rein things in. I mean, remember, this is a market that has experienced a tremendous amount of volatility, particularly over the last 18 months. We've seen a massive multi-trillion-dollar sell-off in China. A lot of these issues are really, really sort of deep and painful within the market here. And so I think that if you're Xi Jinping, looking at the guys that you have in place to sort of regulate the markets here, you want to make sure that you're trying to prevent any further volatility as much as you possibly can.
One thing that we point out in our story is it's unclear how widely this is being implemented. And perhaps it doesn't need to be implemented once you put this statement out. Institutional investors don't want to fall foul of the regulator, and so they will make sure that they are not net sellers. Is that what we're seeing or hearing?
Yeah, I mean, I think that at this point, a lot of what the government is trying to do here is, they're sending a message, right? And I think that that's really a key thing here. You're right that it's not entirely clear how widely this ban is being applied. I mean, obviously, I think, it's really sort of keying in on major institutional investors. You do have to remember, though, as well, that, Chinese markets have a massive number of mom and pop investors as well. And so those retail investors likely aren't really affected by this thing. And they are really responsible for quite a big part of this market here. But yes, I think at this point, regulators certainly want to send a message saying, we're clamping down on this type of behavior. We want to clamp down on volatility. We've seen other, restrictions in recent weeks and months, curbing short selling, that kind of thing. So I think it's really, again, about alleviating the selling pressure within the market.
And we don't have an indication as to whether this policy is going to be lasting or whether it's just kind of a temporary adjustment to let the market kind of settle in, do we?
Yeah, we don't really know that. I mean, I think that, again, at this point, I wouldn't be surprised if we see additional measures announced or, sort of implemented in the next few weeks or so. This is a government that's really trying to stem this really incredible market rout right now. And so whether these are temporary curbs, whether these are long-lasting curbs, I mean, a lot of this is really just about stemming the bleeding at the moment.
A couple of other quick areas, perhaps you can comment on both. One, that the CSRC is putting together this task force with the exchanges themselves to monitor short selling. So it looks like some of that will dry up. And this other one, which is pretty interesting too, that China is drafting a law to promote the development of the private sector economy.
Yes, well, I think that, on that first point in terms of creating that task force, again, I think speaks to just the bevy of different measures that the government is rolling out to try to, again, curb volatility within the market. And then, yes, when it comes to the private sector, I mean, look, the private sector does not have a ton of confidence in China's government and economy right now. They obviously have very, very long-standing concerns about treatment, preferential treatment for state-owned, enterprises versus private firms. That's been a major theme, particularly over the last couple of years within China. So I think that anything that the government can do to try to instill some level of confidence in these private firms, telling them, look, we do have your back and we do want to help you grow and develop, is going to maybe go some way toward restoring some of that sentiment there.
So there's a People Congress meeting at the early part of March. Do I have that right? And is that going to be an opportune time for more policy to be rolled out?
Yes, so that's really that meeting of those top legislators in China. It's the most important political meeting that they have of the year. That's going to kick off at the beginning of March, and that's really an opportunity that all of these major, these top leaders, lawmakers have to kind of gather and set this policy agenda for the year. I mean, a lot of these things that they're likely discussing at this upcoming meeting in March, they've probably already been working on for quite some time. But I think just formalizing, any sort of arrangements that they have for the trajectory for the rest of 2024. They're likely going to announce their economic growth target for the year. That's really, I think, an important agenda-setting meeting on that calendar as we get into the rest of this year.
All right, Jill, thanks for joining us. Jill Disis, Bloomberg's China Eco-Gov Editor.
All right, let's pick up on that theme of Donald Trump possibly being elected to the U.S. presidency. We are joined now by Bloomberg Opinion Columnist Karishma Vaswani, who joins us from our studios in Singapore. Karishma, it's always a pleasure. And you've been writing about what a Trump election to the presidency might mean for Taiwan. Break that down for me.
Yeah. So, to be fair, when Trump was in power, arguably there had been no better American president for Taiwan until, of course, Biden came along, because since we've had President Biden in the White House, there have been a number of things that he's done in comparison to the former President Trump that has helped to boost support for Taiwan internationally. But just looking at some of the rhetoric that's come out of Donald Trump in this campaign, and I want to point to an interview that he's done recently with Fox News, where he suggested that perhaps Taiwan would not be the most urgent priority for his White House, if indeed he does make it into the White House in November. That has raised a lot of concern in this part of the world, obviously in Taipei, but even further afield with the American partners like Japan, the Philippines, and Australia. And it's a real issue of American credibility out here, because how the U.S. Manages the Taiwan issue with China is being seen as a test of American leadership across the region.
Yeah, as you say, Joe Biden has taken one extra step, even talking about the possibility of coming physically to the defense of Taiwan in the event of an attack. And President Trump seems like, as you say, that he's taken back a step a little bit. And perhaps that's consistent with his basic America First policy. So the question then arises, if China was emboldened by this, whether it would be a kind of literal move or just a figurative one.
I think it's important to look at the signaling out of Beijing. And just in the last week or so, we have seen that there has been appetite from China to escalate tensions, relatively speaking. The recent incident of 2 Chinese fishermen that unfortunately died tragically in Taiwanese waters off the island of Jinmen, Taiwanese controlled, has prompted the Chinese to say that they're going to increase their patrols in this area. A Chinese Coast Guard, in fact, boarded a Taiwanese tourist vessel a couple of days ago. That really scared people in Taiwan. And I think it is important, ahead of the May 20th inauguration of the new president, Lai Ching-te, who is, of course, from the Democratic Progressive Party, the politician that possibly China hates the most right now. I think we will continue to see an escalation of what is called gray zone activities by Beijing, and culminating in whatever the Chinese want to signal ahead of that inauguration speech on May the 20th. That's pivotal.
You cite a report from Bloomberg Economics suggesting there could be a 25% probability of a major crisis in the Taiwan Strait in the next 5 years, 10% risk of some form of conflict. I'm wondering, though, whether that analysis was assuming a Biden presidency or a Trump presidency, and how the calculation might shift. We can put that aside for the moment. The other thing we need to address, the economic consequences, right? I think that cannot be ignored. We were talking about the results from Nvidia a short while ago. This company relies on Taiwan Semiconductor to produce all of its chips. And I think that's the big elephant in the room, is it not?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, the pivotal role, the key role that Taiwan plays in the global supply chain, particularly when it comes to these high value chips. I mean, they're in everything, right? Like from your television set to extremely sophisticated technological equipment. And the numbers are staggering. According to Bloomberg Economics, this analysis was released in January this year. They put the global price tag of an invasion at around $10 trillion, and that's equal to about 10% of global GDP. And importantly, this exceeds the blow from the war in Ukraine, the pandemic, and the 2008 financial crisis. And I was listening to a podcast where Matt Pottinger, the former, deputy of the NSC during Trump's administration, was speaking, and he said that if there was to be an invasion, I'm paraphrasing him, of China into Taiwan, it would make what is happening in the Middle East right now and in Ukraine look like child's play. Sure, he's overblowing that a little, but I think it speaks to the point that we're making here.
Yeah, that's why I asked about the difference between a sort of literal attack or perhaps just a figurative one. And Doug mentioned economic, but you also have socioeconomic, and you also have cultural warfare in a sense. I mean, there's a lot of pressure that China could put on Taiwan that might go unattended by a presidency of Trump.
Yeah, and it's already happening. It's such a good point. It's the digital misinformation. It's the fact that, when I was out on the island of Jinmen just in January, rather, when you speak to people there, they can see China across the ocean, and it's not that far away. And, I think there's two things happening. One, there is a real desire for stability. I mean, who doesn't want that, right? And the people of Taiwan are just like you and I. They certainly don't want war. But then there's the other aspect where it feels like their own sense of sovereignty and decision-making is being threatened on a daily basis. They have a clear sense of their identity, particularly amongst young people there. That is growing, and that's what Beijing doesn't want to see.
Yeah, in the time that we have left, I can only give you about 15 seconds to deal with the issue of the U.S. expanding its coalition. Would that include countries in the APAC region, do you think?
100%. Japan, South Korea, Australia, and the Philippines, all key allies.
All right, Karishma, we'll leave it there. Always a delight. Karishma Vaswani, Bloomberg Opinion Columnist, joining us from Singapore to talk about the possibility of what a Donald Trump re-election might mean for the future of Taiwan.
This is the Bloomberg Daybreak Asia podcast, bringing you the stories making news and moving markets in the Asia Pacific. Visit the Bloomberg Podcast channel on YouTube to get more episodes of this and other shows from Bloomberg. Subscribe to the podcast on Apple, Spotify, or anywhere else you listen. And always on Bloomberg Radio, the Bloomberg Terminal, and the Bloomberg Business app.